Okay, there we go. So we're picking up this portion here after the past couple of days. We've sort of broken down and very oversimplified what you have with political ideas and the definition of what people mean when they're talking about left versus right politically. And we also looked at the fact that leftist thinking, at least modern leftist thinking, really traces itself back to a German philosopher, economist, historian, newspaper author, or a newspaper journalist, Karl Marx, who spread his leftist ideas through his news reporting and how it was that he portrayed events going on in light of his own philosophical views about politics and economics. On the flip side, you have another German philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche, who is sort of like the great architect of modern right wing thinking. So let's now, for a moment, step back. We're going to look at one more philosopher. And this one is going to be in a little bit of a different perspective here. Let me move this out of the way. Up here. Okay. I do not have access to my laser pointer. I feel bad about that. So when we talk about the United States, okay, and we have this background of looking at what left and right were, let's talk about the U.S. And the question, we have to go back to the very beginning of the year when we were talking about like the foundational principles of what the Civil War was really about. When the founding fathers were working to create a government, they had a very basic question that they asked. And that question is, what is the best opportunity for people? And by opportunity, the best chance to thrive and succeed on every level possible. Now, in the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson talks about this idea of inalienable rights. And remember that an inalienable right is something that cannot be taken away because it's given to you by God. In Marxism, inalienable rights don't exist because God does not exist. Rights are given to you by the government. Whatever right or authority you have comes from the government. The government giveth, the government can taketh away. Blessed be the name of the government. Because for Marx, the government essentially is God. Now, on the opposite side, you have Freddie, who does not believe in inalienable rights because there is no God again. Inalienable rights don't exist, but what does exist is rights that people achieve for themselves. And they exist so long as you are strong enough to keep those rights for yourself. So that in Friedrich Nietzsche's eyes, the individual essentially is God. And the rights come from the individual's ability to achieve them and to hold them. The Constitution was set up. If you look at the preamble in the Bill of Rights, it really, really enshrines this concept of inalienable rights and talks about building, a more perfect union and providing for and promoting the general welfare. Well, how do you do that? The founders looked at a variety of different options. They talked about direct democracy and they rejected it. They adopted a Republican form of government where you elect representatives to do the work of voting on your behalf. They debated the idea of a limited government versus an authoritarian government. Without going into far too much detail on this, There's a British philosopher named Thomas Hobbes who argued the value of absolute government. And Hobbes was very influential among many of the founders. But in the end, they decided to go with limited government, with the idea that the best chance for people to succeed and thrive was by limiting government. Now, why would you say that? Well, we'll get to that in a second. There's also an economic question. Do we want a free market where people make choices and where people freely engage in economic activities? Or do we want a market where the government controls it? And what about property? Well, early on, property was a big enough question that was the single most important requirement to vote. I mean, many people have this misconception that it was only women who were excluded from voting and black people in America. That's not true. Early on, unless you actually owned property, you couldn't vote. There's actually a fairly, I think, sound and logical argument behind this, which is there was a very distinct fear on the part of our founders that if you allowed people who had no property to vote, you would get people who were voting for politicians who promised to give them stuff. And it would then become a competition between political opponents to promise more and more free stuff to people to get votes from them. So, what is this best opportunity that we can do, that we can achieve? We have all these questions to answer. Well, that's where this thick boy comes in. This is yet another philosopher, but he is not a German, nor does he have epic facial hair. He has a wig. This is Scottish philosopher Adam Smith. Smith wrote two books. The first one was, I believe, something called the moral imperative or something, or the theory of morality or something. It basically talked about the idea of how it was that we, arrived at morality and ethics and what we practically did with them, and how we lived them. But the more important book was a a study that was published by him in 1776, not coincidentally the same year that we declared independence. And this book was called An Inquiry into the Wealth of Nations, or simply The Wealth of Nations. And what Smith did is that he examined a series of major successful civilizations. And he looked over what it was that they had in common to see if he could find like a particular like linking thread between them, or to be able to come to a conclusion. And his theory or hypothesis or his conclusion was that throughout all of human history, governments that left the market alone to be run by the people involved, the consumers, were better off economically, and their people were better off overall. And even though he never uses this term, what Adam Smith is really arguing for, so this idea, by the way, is called capitalism. It's the concept of allowing people to make choices and allowing the market to react to those choices without interference from the government. This concept of not interfering by the government, it has a term applied to it. It's a French term, laissez-faire, that literally means to leave alone or to not touch. In fact, the laissez here is very close to the English word lazy, hands off. And what Smith argued was not just an economic argument, that people were better off if they had the freedom to choose to engage in economic activities if they chose. But he also argued that when the government stayed out of economics and limited what it did as much as possible, people benefited more. Every one of the founding fathers read Adam Smith. Even though Smith was not at the Philadelphia Convention, the Continental Congress, nor was he at the Constitutional Convention, his ideas certainly were there. Ironically enough, when this book was published in 1776, several very important English politicians read this, and including the British Prime Minister at the time. And they came to the conclusion that Smith was arguing that Great Britain should let the colonies at the time basically run themselves and engage in trade however they wanted. The prospect of losing all of the money that the colonies were engaging with and in just didn't appeal to them, and the British government rejected Smith's books outright. However, several years after the American Revolution officially ends and we become a free country, the British begin adopting his policies and spreading them throughout their empire. So that by 1900, England was the largest and wealthiest empire in the history of the world. At one point in time, that dinky little island controlled literally 25% of the world's land, or 20% of the world's landmass, and had something in the neighborhood of 25 to 40% of the world's population under its rulership. And that was largely from following Adam Smith's idea, in hindsight, of this free market, hands-off economic and government approach. Okay, we'll pick this up later. Peace and love. Oops, let's go back to the one.